She found out her father left her $70 million the same day she discovered he'd been murdered. The phone call came at midnight, and Sarah knew before she answered that her father was dead. He didn't make it. Margaret's voice cracked through the speaker, raw and theatrical. The doctors tried everything, baby. He fought so hard. He loved you so much. Sarah stood frozen in her London hotel room, the city lights blurring through her window. 12 hours ago, she'd spoken to her father. His voice had been strong, optimistic even. "The treatment's working, Peanut," he'd said. "I'll be back on my feet in no time." Now he was gone. Something cold slithered down her spine, not grief, not yet. Something else. Something that tasted like metal and felt like a warning whispered in the dark. "What happened?" Sarah's voice came out steady, controlled. She was good at that. 27 years of being Richard Caldwell's daughter had taught her to keep her cards close. His heart just gave out. Margaret sobbed again, and Sarah could picture her perfectly, 40 years old and still devastating, with the kind of beauty that made men stupid and daughters suspicious. "The funeral's in 5 days. Please come home." Sarah booked the flight before the call ended. But she didn't cry. Not yet. Because somewhere in the back of her mind, a question was already forming, sharp and insistent. How does a man go from optimistic to dead in less than 12 hours? The thing about Margaret Sinclair Caldwell was that she'd never wanted to be anyone's stepmother. Sarah had known that from the moment her father introduced them 5 years ago, when Sarah was freshly graduated from Columbia and still raw from her mother's death. Margaret had looked at Sarah the way a cat looks at a closed door, something inconvenient standing between her and what she wanted. What Margaret wanted was Richard Caldwell's money. His status. His penthouse on the Upper West Side. His reputation as one of Manhattan's most successful import-export moguls. What she didn't want was his daughter. The feeling was mutual. Sarah had caught Margaret with Johnson 6 months into the marriage. Johnson, the bartender at the club where Margaret spent her afternoons pretending to do charity work. 28, all sculpted abs and empty eyes, the kind of man who looked good in expensive clothes he didn't pay for. Sarah had told her father. She'd shown him the photos she'd taken with her phone, Margaret pressed against the bar storage room wall. Johnson's hands under her dress, her head thrown back in pleasure she'd never shown Richard. Her father had looked at the photos for a long time. Then he'd said something that still haunted Sarah. "She reminds me of your mother in some ways. The way she laughs. The way she moves through a room." Sarah had wanted to scream. Her mother, brilliant, kind Elena Caldwell, had been nothing like Margaret. But grief does strange things to people. It makes them see ghosts where there are only predators. After that, Margaret had started her campaign. Subtle at first. Forgetting to pass along Sarah's messages. Scheduling couples trips during Sarah's visits home. Slowly, methodically, creating distance between father and daughter. But their bond had been forged in shared loss, and Margaret couldn't break what she didn't understand. Still, she'd tried. And now Richard Caldwell was dead, and Margaret controlled everything, his accounts, his properties, his legacy. Everything except one thing. But Margaret didn't know that yet. Sarah landed at JFK on a Tuesday morning, the kind of gray September day that made New York feel like a noir film. She took a cab straight to the funeral home, her single carry-on bag sitting in her lap like a shield. Margaret was already there, draped in black Prada and genuine tears. She embraced Sarah at the door, her perfume, something expensive and cloying, filling Sarah's lungs like smoke. "I'm so glad you're here," Margaret whispered. "He would have wanted you here." Sarah pulled back, studying her stepmother's face. Margaret's makeup was perfect despite the tears. Her hair was blown out. She wore the diamond earrings Richard had given her for their anniversary, $30,000 worth of sparkle at a funeral. "I want to see him," Sarah said. Something flickered in Margaret's eyes. "Of course. But Sarah, maybe you should remember him how he was. The illness, it changed him. I want to see him." The viewing room smelled like lilies and formaldehyde. Richard Caldwell lay in a mahogany casket that probably cost more than most people's cars. He looked smaller than Sarah remembered. Thinner. His face had a waxy quality that made her stomach turn. But it was his hands that made her stop breathing. His fingernails were blue. Sarah had read enough crime novels, watched enough forensic documentaries. Blue fingernails meant cyanosis. Oxygen deprivation. Poisoning. The doctors said it was his heart, Margaret said from behind her, and Sarah heard it now, the slight edge in her voice. The performance of grief covering something harder, colder. "I want an autopsy," Sarah said. "What?" Sarah turned. "I want to know exactly what killed him." Margaret's face went very still. "Sarah, honey, he was sick. We knew this was coming. He told me the treatment was working. He didn't want to worry you. I want an autopsy." Sarah's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Or I'll request one myself." Suspicious death of a wealthy man with a young wife? The medical examiner will be very interested. They stared at each other across Richard's body. Two women who'd never trusted each other, now openly at war. Margaret smiled, slow and sharp. "If that's what you need for closure, sweetheart." But her eyes said, "You just made a mistake." The funeral was on Friday, a society affair complete with the mayor's office sending flowers and 3 different financial newspapers running obituaries. Richard Caldwell had been somebody. The kind of somebody whose death made waves. Sarah stood at the graveside in a black dress she'd bought that morning, watching faces. Margaret played the grieving widow perfectly, leaning on friends, accepting condolences with brave smiles. The performance of a lifetime. Then Sarah saw him. Johnson stood at the back of the crowd, trying to blend in. He wore a suit that didn't quite fit right and sunglasses even though the sky was overcast. When he caught Sarah looking, he didn't look away. Instead, he smiled. Just a little. Just enough. The arrogance of it made her hands shake. That night, Sarah sat in her hotel room and pulled up everything she could find on Johnson Miller. 28 years old. No college degree. Bartender at 3 different Manhattan establishments over the past 5 years. No social media presence before 3 years ago. It was the last part that interested her. People Johnson's age lived on Instagram, on TikTok. But Johnson Miller hadn't existed online before 2022. Which meant Johnson Miller probably wasn't his real name. Sarah opened her laptop and started digging deeper. She'd learned a lot working in her father's business, including how to trace money, how to spot inconsistencies, how to find what people tried to hide. By 2 a.m., she'd found his real name, Marcus Webb. Convicted of fraud in Florida 8 years ago. Served 3 years. The photo on his arrest record matched Johnson's face exactly. Margaret's boyfriend was a con artist with a criminal record. And now Richard Caldwell was dead. The reading of the will happened on Monday morning in the offices of Whitmore and Associates, the law firm that had handled Richard's affairs for 20 years. Sarah arrived early, her evidence folder hidden in her bag, her face a mask of composure. Margaret swept in 10 minutes late, all apologies and designer grief. She'd brought Johnson, introduced him as a friend who's been helping me through this difficult time. Gerald Whitmore, senior partner and Richard's longtime attorney, looked uncomfortable. He was 65, silver-haired, the kind of lawyer who'd built a career on discretion and dignity. Today, he looked like a man who wished he were anywhere else. "Before we begin," he said, clearing his throat, "I want to express my deepest condolences. Richard was not just a client but a friend." Margaret dabbed at her eyes. Sarah said nothing. Whitmore opened the file. Richard's estate is straightforward. His liquid assets, bank accounts, investment portfolios, pension funds, were, as you know, held in joint accounts with his wife. Those have already transferred to Mrs. Caldwell upon his death. Margaret's spine straightened slightly. Sarah watched her stepmother's manicured fingers tighten on her Birkin bag. As for real property, Whitmore continued, Richard owned 2 properties. The penthouse apartment on West 84th Street, which was his primary residence, and a small farm property in Dutchess County, New York, purchased in 1998. He looked at Margaret. "The penthouse goes to you, Mrs. Caldwell, as specified in the will." Margaret's smile was small but triumphant. "And the farm property," Whitmore's eyes shifted to Sarah, "goes to his daughter, Sarah Elena Caldwell." The room went very quiet. Margaret's smile froze. "That's it?" Whitmore shuffled papers. "That's the extent of the real property, yes." "What about his business?" "His shares in Caldwell Imports?" "Sold 2 years ago. The proceeds went into the joint accounts." Sarah watched her stepmother's face cycle through confusion, anger, and finally, rage barely contained beneath a mask of shock. "There has to be more," Margaret said. Her voice had lost its soft grief. Now it was hard, demanding. "His retirement accounts. His insurance policies. His... Everything is accounted for in these documents." Whitmore slid a folder across the desk. "His bank statements for the past 5 years. As you can see, there were substantial withdrawals over that period, but all legitimate and documented." Margaret grabbed the folder, her hands shaking. Sarah watched her flip through pages, her face growing paler with each one. "Where did it go?" Margaret's voice was almost a whisper. "There were millions. Millions." Whitmore's expression remained neutral. Mr. Caldwell's purchasing habits became quite focused in his later years. He developed an interest in collectibles. Vintage automobiles. Sports memorabilia. According to his records, he made substantial purchases in these areas. "Old junk," Margaret spat. She stood abruptly, the folder scattering papers. "He spent millions on old junk?" No one answered. Johnson sat frozen, his face a mask of controlled fury. Margaret turned to Sarah, and for the first time, the mask fell completely. Her eyes were cold, calculating, filled with a hatred that made Sarah's skin prickle. "Enjoy your farm, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice dripping with venom. "I'm sure your father's dusty memories will keep you warm at night." She stalked out, Johnson following. At the door, he turned back, and for just a moment, he looked at Sarah the way a predator looks at prey. Then they were gone. Whitmore exhaled slowly. That was unpleasant. Mr. Whitmore, Sarah said quietly, I need you to do something for me. Don't process the transfer of the penthouse yet. And I want that autopsy expedited. He studied her. You think? I think my father was too smart to leave millions in accounts my stepmother controlled. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. And I think he's been trying to tell me something. Whitmore nodded slowly. Your father came to see me 6 months ago. He wanted to change his will, but I advised him that given the joint accounts, there wasn't much to protect. He told me. The old lawyer paused. He told me that some things are hidden in plain sight. That the best safe is one that no one wants to open. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The farm. He never let Margaret go there. Said she complained it was too rustic, too old-fashioned. She hated it. Because there was nothing there she wanted. Or, Whitmore said softly, nothing she knew she wanted. Sarah drove to the farm the next morning, a 2-hour journey from Manhattan into the rolling hills of Dutchess County. She hadn't been there in almost 20 years, not since she was 8 years old and her mother was still alive. She remembered it in fragments, a white farmhouse with blue shutters, fields of wildflowers, her father teaching her to fish in the pond while her mother painted on the porch. It had been their escape, their secret place, before cancer took her mother and grief took her father's smile. The reality was smaller than her memory. The farmhouse needed paint. The fields were overgrown. The barn leaned slightly, weathered by decades of winters. It looked abandoned, forgotten. Perfect. Sarah used the key Whitmore had given her. The door stuck, swollen from humidity, but finally gave. Inside, dust motes floated in slanted sunlight. The furniture was covered in white sheets like ghosts. She walked through slowly, breathing in the smell of old wood and memories. Her mother's paintings still hung on the walls, watercolors of the property, soft and beautiful. In the kitchen, her father's coffee mug still sat by the sink, as if he'd just stepped out. Sarah felt the grief then, finally. It hit her like a wave, drowning her in the reality of his absence. She sank into a kitchen chair and let herself cry for the first time since the phone call. For her father. For her mother. For the family that used to exist in this place. When she could breathe again, she started searching. The house yielded little. Old furniture, moth-eaten clothes, boxes of books. Nothing that explained millions of dollars. Nothing that looked valuable. She was about to give up when she noticed something odd in her father's bedroom closet. The back wall didn't sit flush. When she pushed on it, it shifted. Behind the false wall was a safe. Sarah's hands trembled as she tried combinations. Her mother's birthday. Her own. The day they'd bought the farm. Nothing worked. Then she remembered her father's nickname for her. Peanut. Her mother had called her that too, from the ultrasound where she'd been the size of a peanut. She tried the date of that ultrasound. The date her mother had found out she was pregnant. The safe clicked open. Inside was a single envelope. Recent, made of thick cream paper. Her father's handwriting on the front, to my peanut, when you're ready to see. Sarah's hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a CD marked simply, The Truth. She found an old laptop in the farmhouse office, praying it still worked. It booted up with agonizing slowness. Finally, she slid the CD into the drive. Her father's face appeared on the screen, and Sarah's breath caught. He looked older than she remembered, thinner, but his eyes were clear. Alert. The video was dated 4 months ago. "Hi, Peanut." His voice was warm, familiar, and it broke her heart all over again. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone, and you're at the farm. I'm sorry for leaving you. I'm sorry for a lot of things." He smiled, sad and knowing. "I'm sorry I married Margaret. You were right about her, you were always right. She didn't love me. She loved what I could give her. But you know what? For a while, I didn't mind. After your mother died, I was so lonely. Margaret made me feel alive again, even if it was all performance." He shifted in his chair. "But then I started noticing things. Money disappearing. Small amounts at first, then larger. I hired a private investigator. What he found?" Her father's face hardened. "Margaret and Johnson, or Marcus Webb, his real name, have done this before. Twice. Elderly men with money. They romance them, marry them, and then he mimed drinking. A little something in their evening whiskey. Natural causes. Heart failure. They're professionals, sweetheart." Sarah felt ice in her veins. "I know what you're thinking," her father continued. "Why didn't I go to the police?" "Because I didn't have enough proof." "Not yet." "And because—" He smiled sadly. "Because I wanted to protect what I could for you. So I started moving assets. Selling stocks, closing accounts, withdrawing cash. Margaret thought I was spending it on old man hobbies. Let her think that." He leaned forward. "Everything I pulled out went into something Margaret would never understand because she only sees value in new things, expensive things. She never understood that the old can be priceless. Check the barn, Peanut. Behind the workbench. You'll find my collection." His expression softened. "I loved your mother so much. And I love you. You're the best thing I ever did. Don't let Margaret and Johnson get away with this. There's evidence, recordings, documents, all in a safety deposit box at Chase on 86th Street. Box 847. The key is taped under the top drawer of the barn workbench." He paused, and Sarah saw it in his eyes. He knew. He knew how this would end. "Be smart, Peanut. Be careful. They're dangerous. But you're my daughter. You're stronger than they know." He smiled one last time. "I love you. Make them pay." The screen went black. Sarah sat in the silence of the farmhouse, her father's last words echoing in her mind. Then she stood, wiped her eyes, and walked to the barn. It was dark inside, musty with the smell of oil and old hay. The workbench stood against the far wall, covered in ancient tools and dust. Sarah's hands found the edge of the top drawer. Underneath, exactly as he'd said, was a key taped to the wood. Then she looked behind the workbench. At first, she thought it was just tarps covering old equipment. But when she pulled them back, her breath caught. A 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO, cherry red, pristine. She knew enough about cars to know what she was looking at. There were only 39 of these ever made. The last one sold at auction went for $48 million. But there was more. She uncovered it slowly, methodically: a Lamborghini Miura, the original prototype. A Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing. A 2000 championship Formula One race car signed by the entire team. Michael Schumacher's actual racing helmet and gloves, authenticated and preserved. A baseball signed by Babe Ruth. A jersey worn by Michael Jordan in the '96 finals. Original Olympic medals from the 1936 Berlin Games. Box after box of gold coins. Krugerrands, dated from the 70s and 80s. And in a climate-controlled case, share certificates for a tech company her father had invested in 12 years ago. A company that had gone public 5 years later and was now worth billions. Sarah pulled up the stock price on her phone. The shares her father owned, split adjusted and multiplied over the years, were worth $70 million. Margaret and Johnson had killed her father for his bank accounts in his penthouse, never knowing they'd missed a fortune hidden in a barn full of old junk. Sarah started laughing. She couldn't help it. Her father had played them perfectly. He'd let them think they'd won, let them kill him, all while protecting what mattered. Making sure Sarah would find it. Making sure she'd understand. It was brilliant. It was devastating. It was her father's last gift. Sarah drove back to Manhattan with the evidence and the safety deposit key. At Chase, she opened box 847 and found everything her father had promised: recordings of Margaret and Johnson discussing her father's death in detail, planning it, timing it. Documents showing their previous identities, their previous victims, 2 elderly men in Florida and 1 in Texas, all deaths ruled natural until now. Bank records showing money transfers and hidden accounts. Everything she needed. She took it all to the NYPD, to a detective named Sarah Chen who specialized in financial crimes. Chen listened to the recordings, reviewed the documents, and her face grew hard. "We'll need the autopsy results," Chen said. "If they show poisoning." "They will," Sarah said. They did. The medical examiner found cyanide in Richard Caldwell's system, administered slowly over weeks in doses designed to mimic heart failure. Margaret, as his wife, had access to his food, his medication, his evening whiskey. She'd been killing him slowly, and Sarah had been across an ocean while it happened. That guilt would stay with her. But so would what came next. They arrested Margaret and Johnson on a Wednesday morning. Sarah wasn't there. Chen told her it was better if she wasn't, but she watched the news footage later. Margaret being let out of the penthouse in handcuffs, screaming about mistakes, about lies, about how she'd loved Richard. Johnson staying silent, already planning his defense. The trial took 8 months. Sarah sat through every day of it, watching prosecutors lay out the case. Margaret and Johnson, real names Margaret Kincaid and Marcus Webb, had been running this con for 6 years. 3 dead men, millions stolen, lives destroyed. The jury took 4 hours to convict them both on all counts. Multiple murder, fraud, conspiracy. Life in prison without possibility of parole. Sarah felt nothing watching them led away. No triumph, no satisfaction. Just a deep, aching emptiness where her father used to be. The penthouse reverted to the estate. Sarah put it on the market and never walked through it again. She couldn't bear to be in the space where her father had slowly been poisoned, where Margaret had pretended to love him while planning his death. The sale, combined with her father's hidden assets, made Sarah wealthy beyond anything she'd imagined. $70 million from the shares. Another 20 million from the car collection. 10 million from the memorabilia. The gold. The property. Money she'd never wanted. Money that came soaked in her father's blood. She kept the farm. Renovated it, restored it, turned it into something beautiful again. The Ferrari stayed in the barn, under a tarp. She couldn't bring herself to sell it. It was the last thing her father had touched, the last piece of his plan. Sometimes she'd go out there and just sit in the driver's seat, running her hands over the wheel he'd gripped, breathing in the scent of old leather and memories. Crying for what was lost. Grateful for what remained. 2 years after the trial, Sarah sat on the farmhouse porch where her mother used to paint, watching the sun set over fields now wild with flowers. She'd started a foundation in her father's name, helping victims of financial fraud, elderly abuse, families destroyed by con artists. She'd turned her inheritance into something that mattered. Something that would have made him proud. Her phone rang. Chen's number. Johnson died, the detective said without preamble. Prison fight. Thought you should know. Sarah felt nothing. And Margaret? Still inside. She'll die there. Good. After Chen hung up, Sarah sat in the golden light and thought about love and how it destroys us. How her father had loved her mother so much that Margaret's pale imitation had been enough. How that love had blinded him, made him vulnerable, eventually killed him. But also how that same love had saved Sarah. How her father had seen through the fog of his loneliness and grief, had planned and schemed and protected her until the very end. How he'd turned his own death into a weapon against the people who'd wielded it. Love was dangerous. Love was devastating. But also, sometimes, love was the only thing that endured. Sarah pulled out her phone and opened the video app. She'd saved the CD to digital, couldn't bear to lose it. She pressed play and watched her father's face appear, watched him smile at her from beyond death. "Hi, Peanut," he said, like he always did. "Hi, Dad," she whispered back. And in the dying light of a day that would never end, in a farmhouse full of ghosts and memories and priceless things hidden in plain sight, Sarah let herself believe that somewhere, somehow, he heard her. That love, after all, was stronger than death. That she'd made him proud. 3 years later. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office called Sarah on a Tuesday morning. "We've been contacted by authorities in Arizona," the prosecutor said. They found another victim. Same MO as Margaret and Marcus. This one happened 8 years ago, before Florida. Before Texas. The victim's daughter wants to talk to you. Sarah closed her eyes. Another family destroyed. Another person who'd learned too late that monsters come with beautiful smiles and empty promises. "Give her my number," Sarah said. Because this was the legacy now. Not just the foundation, not just the money. But this, using what her father had taught her, his cunning, his planning, his understanding that the best revenge is survival, to help others find their own justice. Margaret Kincaid would die in prison. Marcus Webb was already dead. But their victims, the ones who survived, deserved more than closure. They deserved to know they weren't alone. Sarah stood at the window of her Manhattan office, smaller than her father's had been, but hers, and looked out at the city. Somewhere down there, predators were hunting. Somewhere, someone was trusting the wrong person, loving someone who would destroy them. But also somewhere, survivors were finding their strength. Fighting back. Refusing to let death be the end of the story. Her father had taught her that. In the end, it was the only lesson that mattered. Sarah picked up the phone and called the woman in Arizona. When she answered, Sarah said the words she'd learned to say, the words that mattered most. "I believe you. I understand. And you're not alone." The work would never be finished. But some things were worth fighting for forever. Love. Justice. Memory. The legacy of a man who'd hidden millions in old cars and vintage jerseys, who'd died protecting his daughter, who'd turned his murder into a message that echoed beyond the grave. The old can be priceless. The forgotten can be invaluable. And love, real love, finds a way. Sarah hung up and turned back to her desk, to the Foundation's files, to the next case. Her father's face smiled at her from a photo on the wall, young, happy, standing with her mother at the farm. "I'm still fighting, Dad," she said softly. "Just like you taught me." The sun set over Manhattan, painting the city in shades of gold and shadow. And in a farmhouse in Dutchess County, a Ferrari sat under a tarp, waiting. Priceless and patient and protected. Just like everything worth keeping. Just like love that refuses to die.